I want to ask you what you think the obligation of the US government to the Afghan people is or should be right now. Because something that I think am a little bit concerned about is you hear you hear lots of people kind of hand wringing or perhaps expressing genuine concerns right now about what is going to happen to the Afghan people who are now going to be subject to the oppressive, regime of the Taliban. And we've been seeing a lot of footage of people scrambling to the airport, trying to leave Afghanistan. I know that lots of people are specifically concerned about the plight of women and girls. Who again are people worry that their sort of freedoms and their rights are going to be curtailed under this repressive regime. I have some thoughts, but first, what do you think the U.S. government's obligations are?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a tricky question because in a way it's like it's almost too late for that. And what I mean is that, I mean, the obligation is to not fuck things up so bad in the first place. And it's like, okay, well, we've done that, but it's like I don't trust an abuser now to like rectify the situation if they're still being abusive. That's not the best analogy, but it's like, yeah, our obligation was like to not be destabilizing the Middle East for the last century.
Right.
It's like at the end of the day, even if the intentions were good, totally good, like you can't remake a country from the outside, and it's like the damage has been done. It's so deep. It's so long standing. I really don't know what you can do now. It's like, of course, if we lived in a socialist world, yeah, we would love to think like socialist United States could help out socialist Afghanistan in some way, but that's not the case. And, I think just to speak more broadly, I know, and it's not like the Taliban, it singularly comes down to the United States' fault that the Taliban exists, of course, but like throughout the Middle East and throughout history, especially in the 20th century, the force throughout the Middle East against, sectarian divisions and religious extremism actually has been the organized left, whether in the form of liberal, communist, socialist. Many countries actually had stable parliamentary democracies, and these were the bulwark against what we're seeing now. And the United States had a clear, direct role in just eliminating, and literally through like massacres as well, that sort of left base. And now you see what's left in its wake. One of the best examples many people notice in Iran, in 1953, again, they had a parliament that was functioning. They elected someone who was going to nationalize the oil, and they were overthrown. But again, and when you do that, you kind of eliminate the base of civil society that actually wants to create what we claim we want them to create. And that's why, I think we should also not accept when some people are like, well, some people just don't want democracy. We can't force them. I'm like, well, I think actually many do. But again, we've eliminated the social base that would create that in many cases.
Yeah. I just want to add that I totally agree with what you said. I think that if the U.S. had an obligation, the U.S. does have an obligation to Afghanistan, but at this point, it's sort of too little too late, as you were saying, or that obligation should have kicked in many, many years ago. I think that now the obligation is to leave Afghanistan. And then I just want to, of course, throw out there to accept as many refugees and provide support to them as possible. Of course, that is going to be, another political fight in the coming months. And I also want to say, I do. So now, after this weekend, I think almost every major mainstream outlet has run like at least one, if not multiple articles about how women in Afghanistan are terrified and how bad things are going to be for women and girls under the Taliban. Obviously, I understand that concern, but I think that if the last 20 years have taught us anything, it's that they've shown that so-called humanitarian intervention, let alone, quote, feminist intervention, is completely a farce. I am not making any excuses for the Taliban. I don't have any doubts that they will be particularly brutal and repressive to women. They have been in the past. We all know this. At the same time, when, war is not good for women either. And when you look at Afghanistan under U.S. occupation, I think that the advances that women made under those conditions have been a little bit overstated, to be honest. Literacy among women and girls is still extremely low in Afghanistan, or it was even during the US occupation. I think it was something like 30%. It's true that some women were, able to go to college and, go to school and gain more of an education than they had before. But again, I think I read that something like 2/3 of women, in Afghanistan, even as I said, during the US occupation, weren't in school. So again, I think that a lot of these gains have been really overstated. That's not to say that things can't get worse. Of course they can. But we've just seen so many times how this type of rhetoric, the rhetoric of gender equality, especially when it's about some people over there and not here, is used to justify military intervention.
Right. And, of course, if the United States was serious about this, the first thing they would do is not be loyal allies with the ruling regime of Saudi Arabia. That would be first on the list. And just, one more thing also I'm interested to see is like from the fallout of this, how is this going to affect the far right globally? Because I think, going back to the crises in Libya and Syria and the refugee crisis that came out of that, I think that was one major component of the rise of the far right, because all of a sudden the question of immigration is very real and visceral to people. And, I suspect there will be another refugee crisis almost out of this. And I think it will be interesting to watch, especially throughout Europe, how that might affect the European far right.
I want to talk about just the staggering cost of war. And I know that a couple different people have hit this, but I saw a pretty stunning sort of set of statistics in I think AP or Reuters recently. So I want to bring that up now and look at it. So this article collected, as I said, statistics about the cost of war, and I found this part really compelling. So the amount that President Harry Truman temporarily raised top tax rates to pay for the Korean War was 92%. Lyndon Johnson raised top tax rates to 77% to pay for the Vietnam War. Not that either of those two wars were justified in any sense because they were well funded, but just to put it into perspective, President George W. Bush cut tax rates for the wealthiest rather than raise them at the outset of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars by at least 8%. We know that the amount of direct Afghanistan and Iraq war costs that the U.S. has financed through debt is around $2 trillion. Interest is estimated to cost up to $6.5 trillion by 2050. And then this was also another interesting statistic. One researcher estimated that the U.S. has committed to pay basically more than $2 trillion in healthcare, disability, burial, and other costs for the 4 million Afghanistan and Iraq veterans. Those costs are estimated to peak after 2048. So, we've been hearing more about the costs of this war. They are staggering. And I want to bring up a tweet by Qasim Rashid, the politician and the author, who sort of puts this massive cost into context by showing what that money could buy here at home in the US. So, of course, $2 trillion spent on the war in Afghanistan. That could end homelessness for the low cost of $20 billion here in the US. That could pay for insulin for diabetics. That could fund universal pre-K, fund SNAP for 40 million Americans, pay for universal four-year college, cancel all medical debt, and cancel all student debt. And again, that's staggering. And I think, a lot of the rhetoric that we heard, I guess, last year and the year before about defunding the police and so on, sort of got at this kind of like guns or butter argument, right? Like we want to fund social services and not violence and, militarization and policing. But I think the difference here is, as we pointed out on the show before, defund the police by focusing on the municipal budget, I think was sort of constrained insofar as the municipal budget can't really pay for as many of these social services as we would like. However, this massive war chest can. So I think that, we always have to point that out.
Yeah. And I think, what's particularly disgusting is that, while they're paying so much for these wars, they're trying to cut the VA, Veterans Affairs, Yeah. And I think sometimes it gets tricky for the left because, we want to be anti-imperialist, criticize the wars while also realizing, often the people fighting them are working class people,
Mhm.
it in certain situations are not always aware of what they're doing fully. And I think this is something that, to go back to Uncle Bernie, that Bernie Sanders did pretty well in that. He had some groundbreaking bills and like actually working with Republicans supporting the VA. And I think that is something good that will strike a balance of not seeming, quote unquote, disrespectful to people
Mhm.
that have served and saying like, no, actually, we want to make sure we take care of them after the war and
Mhm.
not abandon them. So I think that's a good issue to kind of emphasize and say we should be doing that instead of fighting new wars.
Yeah. I think, wasn't it Eugene Debs who said, maybe I'm paraphrasing, but said something like the rich wage war and the poor fight them? I think that, I
Right.
know that Bernie has said something similar like that before as well. And I think that perfectly threads the needle of wanting to support working class people who, find themselves enlisting in the military for lack of better options, and also being critical of the war machinery itself. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe. You can also watch the full episode and catch our future live streams by clicking the join button below and becoming a Jacobin YouTube member. Thanks.